Good day, everyone listening and watching to this program by DutchCulture. DutchCulture is the Dutch organization for international cultural cooperation. DutchCulture tries to support and inform artists in Europe to collaborate with a variety of artists internationally. Besides informing and supporting and advising artists, we also try to support the diplomatic posts all over the world, so that's the embassies and consulates, especially in 23 so-called focal countries. These are the countries that the Dutch international cultural policy is focusing at. And one of these countries is Poland. And we decided to dedicate a program, a country focus on Poland. The program is entitled Far Too Many Stories, and we will shed a little bit of light on the background of this title later on in the conversation in the program. But a warm welcome to all of you again, especially in recent times. Poland is pending between liberalism and more conservative currents, especially political currents that influences not only society in Poland, but therefore also the arts scene. So for us, it was an important reason to see how much do we in the Netherlands know of Poland, and especially the cultural scene? How is the current scene reacting upon the political, ideological landscape of Poland in the beginning of the 21st century? And how do, for instance, the artists, but also minority groups, LGBTQ groups, and for instance also laws on abortions, how does it affect the atmosphere and therefore also the artistic practices of a variety of makers? Complex subject matters, but we have a limited amount of time, so we try to focus on these topics as good as possible. And of course, we're doing this with some guests. The guests are Karolina Plinta. We will start with her with a short keynote, and then we'll continue with a conversation on the visual arts scene. We are doing this with Małgorzata Ludwisiak and Bik Van der Pol. That's a Dutch artistic duo. And then after a conversation with them, we will focus on the performing arts. And we're doing this with Grzegorz Reske, a performing arts curator and producer. And we will end our short yet informative program with a panel discussion with all the guests. Having said this, we will start with a keynote speech given by Karolina Plinta. And Karolina Plinta is not only an art critic, but first and foremost also the deputy editor-in-chief of Szum magazine, the renowned, highly acclaimed Szum magazine. And Karolina, you're already joining us. Welcome to our program. And I would like to ask you to do the kickoff after my introductory words with the keynote speech. Karolina, the floor is all yours.
Art scene in Poland is quite varied and divided. Unfortunately, it is now forcing the problem that the state policy, cultural policy, changed in Poland. It started in 2015 and it's growing. Our Ministry of Culture definitely take the position, conservative position, and try to change the part of the scene to more conservative. Firstly, I want to say that in Poland we understand a little bit different the words like liberal, leftist, and conservative. Liberal means in the field of culture, it's more positive than maybe in the Netherlands. It's associated with more tolerant worldview. It's more about focusing on professionalization and building the international position, but also searching for global trends. If you are liberal, you think about Poland as a part of the European Union, but also it means that you are not very critical to art market, for example. Leftists are more focused on working conditions, social rights of artists, and the conservatives are in the opposition. They prefer isolationism, traditional values and Christian culture. Fortunately, not every institution, not all the scene change in this way, because Polish art scene is very divided, and it's mostly divided between public scene and institutions that are financed by state or by cities. The second one is independent scene, having funds from different sources. As for the state institutions, they are depending on the Ministry of Culture. So minister is the person who is deciding about the program of maybe not directly, but he chose the director, or he prepared the competition for these directors. And mostly now it happens that most of the directors of the state institutions are chosen by a minister. Their views are the same as the Conservative Party. So this is like similarity. I prepared some examples of the conservative institutions, like they're mostly national museums, and some in Warsaw, Poznań, Wrocław, Kraków, Gdansk. So this is, let's say, one big institution, or the idea of this museum seem quite similar. They are more focused on traditional art, old art, this kind of art that is focused on more universal values like eternity or God. And probably this is the future direction of National Gallery Zachęta in Warsaw and Art Museum in Łódź. Exception of this rule is Polin Museum in Warsaw and Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, that probably next year will be a city gallery. The different situation there is with the cities or municipal galleries, because the situation there depends on the local government, and very often they are more liberal. And so these institutions have more freedom, have more progressive program. The example can be here City Gallery in Białystok, that is focused mostly on the art from Eastern Europe, from Belarus and Ukraine, very support Ukrainian and Belarusian art scene. Recently, they started to be more leftist institution, even they prepared the exhibition about anarchism. Second example can be City Gallery in Poznań. It's called the same Arsenal, but this is different institution. It's West Central Poland. And they are most focused on politics of empathy, of tolerance. They try to reflect on categories that like sickness or the disability, to rethink them, to make some political stands that change the institution to more inclusive. In Warsaw, I recommend going to Biennale Warszawa. This is a kind of think tank institution. It's not only the event once a year, but Biennale Warszawa is working whole the year. The program is very focused on economic, social, and environmental issues. Now I will go to the independent scene, and I want to speak about places that I recommend to work in or just visit. First is the Local 30. This is commercial art gallery in Warsaw, but it started also to function as a feminist think tank. They organize seminars discussing some feminist discourses, and I think they make great job. Next one is Komuna Warszawa. It's more focused on performance, independent theater. Funny thing is that they started as an anarchist collective in 90s, and now they are probably the most important independent institution that is focused on performative arts. Next one is Radio Capital. It's a community radio focused on alternative music, cooperating with the journalists, with artists. Probably this is the most experimental radio now in Poland. This is community radio. I'm also contributing with them, so I recommend to listen to them. Next place, Domi, is in Poznań. On daily basis, it serves as studio for artists. The curators of this place, or maybe the owners, they are creating a program also focusing on empathy practice, building the relationships, taking care of each other's. They have very critical program. And the last one is Consortium of Post-Artistic Practice. This is a non-informal artistic community that focus on leftist activism and developing the visuality of the protest. They are a direct response for this conservative turn in the institutions. They openly fight against fascism, but in using the tools that gave them visual arts, or tools from the visual arts. Here is the photo of another demonstration in April this year against Russian invasion of Ukraine. And to sum up, I think that despite the conservative state policy, the good thing is that our art community is still united and is operating in Poland. So the Polish art community did not share the fate of Hungary or Belarus, from which many artists left. We are still trying to develop alternative solutions how to deal with this conservative turn. And as I see, much more institutions and artists started to be critical to the current state's policy. And it's especially visible in the new generation of artists that are promoting a new leftist sensitivity that is something new in Poland. Thank you. This is all.
Thank you so much, Karolina. Before I respond, you also wrote a beautiful article on this new generation that you mentioned in your last sentences, an article that is published on DutchCulture's website, part of our theme, New Gen. We focus on the new generation of artists, and I think especially your article on the Polish new generation of artists is definitely worth to read. Having focused on this new generation and also these independent groups and organizations and initiatives, Karolina, can you describe me how strong are they? Are they easy to emerge, and is it easy for them to literally take the street, or is it really difficult for these new leftist activist groups to start, especially in the current political situation in Poland?
There are several protests organized by artists recently, and the reasons are different. Sometimes it's the problem with some institution like Zachęta that recently changed the director. Another question is how strong it is and if it really can change the state policy. This is problematic, but I think about more that this is work that will be not done immediately, but it's have to be repeated, and I hope that this voice will get stronger, that more people will involve in this, let's say, critical thinking, and then maybe the change will come.
Yes, well, this might be something that we will talk about a little bit longer in the shared panel discussion at the end of the program. But thank you, and you will join us then, Karolina, again. Thank you now for your, informative introduction. And we will focus now on the visual arts in Poland with two guests, one from Poland and one from the Netherlands. But that's an artistic duo that have experience working in Poland. Already now joined by Małgorzata Ludwisiak. Welcome, and wonderful that you could join us for our program. come to focus on Poland.
Hello, and thank you very much for having me here and inviting me. Karolina said a few things about how the art scene in Poland looks like now, but what I would maybe add to it, these are first maybe some details, because the flag institution that was the most important one to change the director for the government was the Center for Contemporary Art in Warsaw, actually. So the institution I used to work for 5 years. So this is a flag institution, and we somehow, on taking the CCA in Warsaw as an example, we can somehow imagine how the future of institutions like the National Gallery Zachęta in Warsaw or Muzeum Sztuki in Lodz might look like in a really very short time period. Because this conservative term, what it means in practice, like for example, the exhibition which was organized last year in the CCA in Warsaw under the title of political art, which how to say that, maybe I will just name it directly, it operated a lot of neo-Nazi content. And included, interestingly, it was an international exhibition, and it included artists like Norwegian artists but also Israeli artists. So it also manipulated a lot the content, because can you imagine an Israeli artist involved in such a kind of frame? What's happening in Poland now is a part of a broader phenomenon, of course, which we have been facing in Europe since many years now, and it's maybe a little bit more faster and brutal sometimes, but of course it has its own shade, which is specific for Poland, and because it's as Karolina mentioned, it's rooted locally in a very local conditions and traditions, without taking into consideration a much broader context. Importantly, I think the ambition of what we can observe, the ambition of the government in any kind of the field in the country, is to take over the whole field. Not some exceptional, be that institutions or activities, but actually the whole field. So they are on their way to colonize the whole culture and take over the whole institutional landscape of most important and active institutions in Poland.
Is the most recent news the replacement of Jarosław Suchan of Muzeum Sztuki in Lodz? Is that also an indication of exactly that process that you're now describing? May I ask you, what is your response? Because he was replaced by Andrzej Biernacki, if I pronounce it right, who was directly chosen by Poland's Deputy Minister of Culture and National Heritage. Is this an indication, if not proof, of the development you're just describing?
Yes, absolutely. Muzeum Sztuki in Lodz and the case of Jarosław Suchan, the long since he's a director of the institution. He used to be a director of the institution for 15 years now. So it was, and I guess it still is, a very hot issue, and we are still working on it in Poland in terms of protesting and really different groups of professionals, not only in Poland but in Europe and all over the world, keep sending letters to the Ministry of Culture to express their concern with the untransparent procedure, but also, and maybe the first and foremost, with the very person that substituted Jarosław Suchan. Because this is, I think, the key word to describe the whole situation is deprofessionalization, which means that the directors that are politically nominated in a completely not transparent way, they have very low or simply and namely no competences to run a public culture institution. In most cases, what we are observing of a national status, right? We are used to have professional directors in Poland since many years now. The artistic scene, including the institutional one, was used to be very rich and diverse in Poland. But it was also managed by professional and experienced managers, people that used to have between 10 or 20 years of managing experience, that know between 1 up to 3 or 4 foreign languages, are historian with broad knowledge, and are respected professionals as curators, writers, managers, with international experiences and connections, networks. So, and what we keep observing since 2015 is that these people, in many cases, they are substituted by especially if we talk about recent cases, people with zero knowledge about the field, how to run or manage institution, art institution, public institution. They speak mostly Polish only, and the knowledge and experience in the field sometimes is really like a zero level.
So this is a rather grim situation that you're sketching. How does the cultural sector or the visual art scene, how is it responding to this, well, very dark development? Is there a form of resilience? Karolina, of course, just focused a little bit also on these independent movements, almost bottom-up activities. How do you value these resilient cultural activities, and do you think they have any chance? Because you quite convincingly described the agenda, which is to take over the whole cultural field. So again, how does the field respond to this, and is there any chance for resilience?
The field responds since many years now in a very active way, and uses many means to protest, be that artistic means, performative artists, including their interventions into exhibitions, or professionals coming from different museum or art fields writing letters to the Ministry of Culture, also professional international bodies like ICA or like CIMAM, which I'm a part of board now, and they also keep argumenting and trying to make their interventions in the Ministry of Culture. But after these many years have passed, I can't see much hope for, there are no tools and no means by which or through which we could protect institutions that were the main actors for artistic product, to support artistic production, to support our artists, artistic communities, and also to develop different communities of public for modern and contemporary art. So unfortunately, it seems that we are going the Hungarian way, and the Hungarian scenario is in the middle of doing.
Yeah, this is definitely something that we will continue on later on if we talk together, to see the perspectives of all other participants for this program. But it's again a grim situation that you're sketching. I'm really also wondering, and this is also something that we will discuss later on, how this will affect international cultural collaboration from Poland with the rest of the world. And perhaps our new guests, thank you for now, Małgorzata. Please stay with us because you will be back. The new guests here are two Dutchmen, Lisbeth Bik and Jos van der Pol, also known as Bik Van der Pol. They're nom de guerre, so to speak, as artists. Bik Van der Pol, welcome. Great to have you here. Yes, let me start with asking the question: how did you manage to work in Poland? What was your consideration to spend a time in Warsaw?
Well, we were already talking for quite a while with Joanna Zielinska. She, at that time, was a curator at Ujazdowski Castle. And she wanted us to work with the collection of the castle, of the CCA. And it's very interesting because that collection became a collection under the first director in 1989, so after the collapse, let's say, of the Soviet Union. And his name was Krukowski. He was a theater man, and he launched a very, very intense program of exhibitions, performances, music performances, etc., etc. I think something like 80 per year. And a lot of works of artists had, I would say that CCA became a hotspot, very, very hip for the whole Western world, and also for, everything came together there because it was really, really a place of freedom and experimentation, and anything was possible, basically. So there was obviously also a lot of hanging out together, also with the director, and there were many works that stayed behind in the CCA. So that became part of the collection, with or without a contract, usually without a contract. And I think we have to really understand also in the Dutch context. Now, Bitte de Wit, currently called Melly Institute, Art Institute, came into existence came into existence actually really in the same time, 1990. And everything in that time, in the 90s, was very, very improvised, I would say. So contracts, etc., as we would have today, would not be so much of an issue, no? So there's lots of stuff in that museum or in that Center of Contemporary Art that was called a collection, but maybe wasn't a collection as official. No, some things also disappeared, etc. Some things were not signed off, etc., etc. So for us, this was very interesting because in 2019, when we were invited, this period was 30 years, of let's say a growth of a Center of Contemporary Art in the city of Warsaw, in a country like Poland, and it also sort of was a time span in which all the excitement of the 90s, internationally also, for sure in Western Europe, changed into a different way. Karolina already explained the liberal and how much that is different, maybe understood in the Netherlands, but I would say the neoliberalism and let's say the strong division between liberal and social, what we also experienced here in the 90s with the purple cabinet, with the purple government, so to say, in the 90s, that sort of disappeared. And I think that similar things happened in Poland. So when we were invited, this was really, really interesting. And maybe something about the title, Far Too Many Stories to Fit into So Small a Box, is derived from Lawrence Wiener. That sentence was on the building. And the building was at some point renovated, and this indicates a very nice event, I would say. The building was renovated, so the plasterwork covered that text, and then after that they thought, oh shit, maybe we should have the text back, and they approached Lawrence Wiener, and then the now widow, because he unfortunately died recently, but his wife and also his manager said, no, you have to pay now. So that also changes, or that shows the change, let's say, in an initial improvised generosity. Yes, you can have this work, and then after 30 years that it actually becomes a real work of value, no? And that also shows you the time span of let's say, the importance and the growth of artists that were exhibiting in the CCA initially for generosity, and then later on these things change because market value also is an issue, obviously, no, internationally.
Yeah, but I think we also use the artworks in the exhibition to as a sort of lens how life nowadays is. You know, so the artworks were produced maybe in the 90s, but you can still read them nowadays, but maybe in a totally different context. So that was also the question we were hoping to formulate through this exhibition.
If your intention was also to include all the different voices that were part of the collection and perhaps even part of the history of the castle, did you also deliberately focus on, for instance, more consultative voices?
Well, there was a lot of it's interesting because we spoke with a lot of people and there was a lot of dispute in between people, and I wouldn't say if it was conservative at that time, but there were lots of fights and disagreements. Some people refused to come to the castle, and so we had to meet them somewhere else because they said, well, I will never go there anymore. So for us it was also a sign of some sort of radical approaches to each other. And conservative, of course, some voices were conservative, but
I wouldn't consider them conservative maybe in the way that you mean with relation to the party. No, I think it's have we interviewed many people that were in those 30 years, but definitely in the 90s connected to the development of that cultural scene. It strongly connected to it, and then at some point it's like many art centers, it's an art center in puberty. Things change somehow. Krukowski stepped back, and then somebody else has to take, and then there was a lot of conflict about the direction of what the museum or the CCA went to. So that's always happening, but I would say that in Warsaw, the voices that were radically for or against something were really, really very strong, no? So like Jos was saying, yes, we had to meet some people outside, and today I would call that conservative voices, but in a different meaning than the political meaning. Because they wanted to keep it as it was, no? Which is not possible necessarily always.
Last question also, because of time restrictions, before we ask Małgorzata to join us again, and we have a mutual conversation. A main objective of this program is to also inform Dutch artists on collaborating with Poland or working in Poland. What are the main challenges for them, in your opinion, also based on your experience? Of course, time has passed and the landscape might have changed already, but what are the, say, in a nutshell, more or less, the do's and don'ts for Dutch artists who want to collaborate with Polish artists?
I think first of all, the language, no? They have to be prepared that not everybody speaks English always. So have many of the interviews, or at least a large part of the interviews, were in Polish. So it was like we had to deal with that, which is fine because you learn to deal with it, no?
No, but I think what you mean is nowadays. I think the biennial, I think that's an interesting space to collaborate with, because they're doing interesting things and they're forming the CCA. I don't know, the Mondrian has a residency. I'm not sure if it's still happening, but I would be cautious to not be in some sort of context put, like also was mentioned before, on the ground of international artists exhibiting in a venue which you could raise questions about the whole programming
today.
So you should really be aware before you step into a context of that, I think.
Yeah, clear. I would almost forget, you also brought a small video.
Yesterday, I presented my performance, Wet Look, in the sculpture garden at Krulikania, while a man I don't know yelled, "Pedal!" It reminded me that public space is not a utopian free-for-all. It is a deeply insecure, heterosexist topography that is governed by its own set of norms. The extent to which we are free in public space is only a mirror of the society in which we live. If the femme nature of my action was provocative enough to invite insult, it only reveals the reality that public space, for any minority, is still the least safe space of all.
This was a performance by, part of a performance by Billy Morgan, one of the performers that we, or that actually Anja Novak, who we invite, she's a choreographer. And we invited her to work with, to select a couple of performers to work with the script that we wrote from the interview. So it's, you already know, experience that it's a very complex script or very complex project, no? So it was an exhibition, interviews, script, sound pieces, performances, labels, posters by Font Arte. So everything was sort of clicking together somehow. And these performances, we had 5 people that Anja worked with, and she herself also made a performance. They are on our website, and they're very, very moving, I think, are based on the script that we gave them as information, but then they could run with it, no? So they could create their own story from it. So we had the interviewers that created the script through our editing process, obviously, our filter, but then Anja and her 4 performers created, let's say, yet another layer on top of that. Now, with their interpretation, young people today that deal with, let's say, public space, which can be a square, a street, a city, but I would also consider a center of contemporary art, a collection, an interpretation, the polyphony of that, a public space. No?
Yeah. I would like to ask Małgorzata Ludwisiak to join us for now. Welcome back, Małgorzata Ludwisiak, Chief Curator of the Modern Art Department of the National Museum in Gdansk, Poland. As said, DutchCulture is really focusing on international cultural collaboration, and of course, Bik Van der Pol's time in CCA is an example of this. And they said, well, be well informed, but be also cautious about with whom you work and how your work might be framed. I use that word also afterwards. How do you value and how do you see the possibilities for international cultural exchange, collaborations, co-creations, perhaps even in contemporary Poland?
What we can't see no hope for in Poland is to regain or fight back the institutions that have been lost. But there is still a lot of hope and a lot of perspectives. So when I was watching to this short video by Bik Van der Pol, I went very emotional and felt very moved, because it was a beautiful project, but also very, very bold, very experimental, and which was, of course, a part of a much bigger project by Bik Van der Pol for our institution. And I think that, when now asks nowadays a question where in Poland this kind of project or this kind of performance might take place or might happen. So it's still possible also to think about some institutional context. Of course, the institutional art scene is shrinking and keeps shrinking. But as I say, there are some city or municipality related spaces or institutions that still might make this possible, like Trafo in Szczecin, or Nomus in Gdansk, or the City Gallery in Gdansk, or or Contemporary Art Center in Gdansk. Actually, Gdansk, which has a lot of reference as well. It has a history of solidarity, protests against the government, and the whole liberal movement started there in the 80s last century. So it's still kind of a context. It still creates a kind of a context for a rich artistic art scene and varied activities. So yeah, I think that I would be looking in if Bik Van der Pol, for example, says we want to repeat this performance, or we would like to I don't know, continue this project with someone else. So there are still some institutions, most of them city galleries or city-run museums or festivals. In Poznan, Gdańsk, Szczecin, or Białystok that make this possible.
Yeah, and Bik Van der Pol, perhaps referring to the last suggestion from Małgorzata, how was the performance, the video that you just showed? How was it perceived? How were the reactions? And do you think that such a project would be possible nowadays? Perhaps hard to answer from Rotterdam, but how was the public reception?
I think the reception was really very good. Mm-hmm. Lots of people, as far as we could see, the time that we were there, and also Johanna reported back, and we spoke a lot with people in the CC also when we weren't there. Many people were very, very interested, and also maybe interesting to say also that they can also stand on themselves, because I showed them here to students and they were equally moved. So it's very, very important, I think, these kind of aesthetic transformations of an interview, basically, of different interviews.
Yeah, but also I think the diversity, reaching from a young woman of 12 to an African man who was already living for 20 years in Warsaw. These voices, you can't hear them in such a context. So and also it was about abuse. One woman was knitting while telling story about abuse. So there are many topics came along. So which for us also was very experimental and interesting, because we didn't know. Because he also gives the responsibility to others, which is I think also part of this whole context, which made it so interesting. Also
what Anja Nova called alienated authorship.
Yeah.
So you sort of
alienated authorship.
Yeah, I think, but I think that's very pointy somehow. And maybe I would like to say one more thing about the residency. Better to suggest to people to yes or no do that. I would say always we have to do this. Everybody always has to do this. I think we all have to be able to. I see residencies like site-specific work as well as a drilling into something. And the site or the environment where you drill yourself into. Sorry for the violence words. But I say there can be violence, or there can be violence in treatment.
Intrusion.
Intrusion can be violent, or can be understood as violent. But then you have to, as an artist, I always trust that we sort of are sensitive to how to deal with this, and to also, I think residencies learn vice versa, or both ways, respect and common sharing somehow. Even I would say when that is perhaps shared with with voices that maybe you wouldn't hang out with too much, but nevertheless we have to continue to speak with each other. Otherwise it's hopeless. Yeah,
absolutely. We will do so also with your voices included at the end of the program. So please stay with us. We will now focus more on the performative arts and the performative art scene in Poland, but perhaps also in the Netherlands. Some differences, or perhaps some things that are similar. We do so with our next honored guest, which is Grzegorz Reske, performing arts curator and producer. Welcome, Grzegorz, to our program. I think you will join us from the Netherlands. I'm not sure, but or are you in Poland?
No, I sit, which would happen to be my house since last half a year in Utrecht, where I moved.
Perfect,
Yes.
perfect. What is your first impression coming from Poland? Of course, being an international citizen, but coming from Poland, working in the Netherlands. What are the differences, or are there also striking resemblances?
Well, the similarity, not so much on the artistic level, but first of all, on the city, is that after a couple of years living in Warsaw, I'm originally from Lublin, and the most of my life I spent in Lublin. And moving to Utrecht is a bit landing in the same context in terms of the size of the city, the dynamic of the city, the huge students movement, also implicating the certain vividity of the artistic discourse in the city, but at the same time, the town, which is in the shadow of big metropole. Technically, Utrecht is much closer to Amsterdam, but when we take under consideration the size of the countries, this 40 minutes train to Amsterdam Central, it's a bit like 2 hours train from Lublin to Warsaw. The influence or the sometimes the tensions between the both urban centers are very much alike, and that's all about the similarities. Then everything else is different. Of course, I'm not landing completely out of the local context. In last years, I was working a lot in the international context, both trying to bring artists from abroad to Poland, bringing Polish artists abroad, working in the context completely outside the Poland, and actually. In the last years, both me and my partner, and also working as a tandem most of the time, we realized that being still based in Poland, actually, the more and more commissions, invitations, requests coming from abroad, and this was step by step. It was leading us to the decision to look for the more permanent position outside the Polish context.
Can you already reveal something of your approach as an artistic director in the Netherlands?
Well, I think approach is more or less the same. I'm always see my position as a curator, as an interpreter, translator between the artists and audiences. This is what I try to do throughout 20 years of my work in different positions, sometimes more creative, sometimes more production perspective. What is interesting maybe, it's that indeed for many years I was working in my hometown, and I believe there are these two most interesting positions for this kind of job I'm running. You can do it either if you are really part of this community from the very beginning and you understand it very well, or as you, if you are kind of parachuter. And I really enjoy this position that whatever and wherever I look right now, it's really without any cliches, I'm trying to at least, but I have also position at the moment to say things which are maybe not necessarily always politically correct, because I come from outside, and I'm trying to keep this fresh position as long as possible, because then you can shift. I believe you can also shift the perspectives of others.
Let's shift ourselves and let's look back to Poland. We just talked also about the independent art scene in the visual culture. Is there also an independent theater scene in Poland? And if so, how strong or how large is this?
Not so much, to be honest. And if it exists, it's very much leaning on the visual arts institutional support, or it used to be, because as we heard in the last hour, the devastation of the institutional constellation of the visual arts in Poland is really significant, and we are, I believe, only at the beginning of watching consequences also for the artistic life, for the makers, for reception of the art, for distribution of the art. I started approximately 20 years ago joining as a producer independent theater group one generation older than me, the group which was originated in late 70s actually. And working as a producer, tour manager, I observed the slow dismantling of the field of independent performing arts, the abilities of touring, abilities of producing. And this happened into two trajectories. I can identify. One was evolution of the platforms for creation and distribution, which was mostly the centers of cultures and the smaller institutions being remains of the pre-1989 communist structure of the public art, but being a niche, being a platform for those independent makers to create, but also to distribute. This turned in the especially in the early 2000s into more and more commercial approach. So we was still publicly subsidized, mostly municipal institutions, but delivering more and more commercial content. This was the one trajectory, and the second was certain approach of the big institutional repertory theaters who were interested to bring more fresh languages, but this invitation was not facilitated with the change of the structures of the production, which ended up with this kind of unbalanced situation of very interesting, often languages and proposals, but being still produced in the very old style, heavy Stadttheater, city theater system. Basically, Komuna Warszawa, who is one and out of very few places where the professional makers can create interesting stuff. They are dealing with big financial problems. That's also something which, to give you the differences between the Netherlands and Poland, Komuna Warszawa, as one of very few organizations in Warsaw, was working finally for the first time under the 4 years structural funds, which ends this year, but still no one in the sector knows if the city of Warsaw will open the next competition for the structural funds. So you cannot plan even few months ahead because of that. And when it comes to choreography, which in the natural way, it is this more independent way of expressing yourself in the performing arts. Most of people continuing the career outside the country, Ania Nowak, mentioned here by name, for many years is based outside of Poland. But indeed, the most important house for the choreography in the last years was not in any of the 18 repertory theaters which Warsaw holds, being either subsidies by the municipality or by the region, and with exception of one national theater. But the majority of responsibility for supporting development of choreography was very much in the hands of Zamek Ujazdowski also. So losing the visual arts, the independent performing arts is very much affected by that as well.
Describing this landscape and also the way the various platforms are financed or were financed makes me also wonder, and perhaps this is the big topic that we haven't addressed yet. How does the performative arts scene, but perhaps more general, the cultural arts scene, respond to what is now, I think, dictating the news, which is the war in Ukraine. And of course, the result, which is, among many other things, a huge influx of refugees, also in Poland, despite perhaps concerns of the safety of Poland. And perhaps it's also good to have the other ones join us now, because it might be something that is a good stepping stone to take the conversation a bit broader. So Karolina Plinta, Małgorzata Ludwisiak, and also Bik Van der Pol, please join us. How is the reaction also in the cultural field? And Grzegorz, please, you're the one to respond first, to the war in Ukraine, but also to the the influx of refugees, which touches so many aspects of social life, political life, and therefore also, I assume, cultural life.
Well, there are a few layers, and I would like to start maybe not from the very artistic perspective, but from the perspective of the society as such. It's of course it's a great disaster. What happened? It's a disaster for entire Europe. It's changing society in a way that the Poland was not, in the perspective of generations which now lives in Poland, experienced. Both such wave of the refugees. You might remember that when there was a big wave of the refugees from the Middle East a few years back, Poland as a state refused to accept the people, the relocation of the refugees within the European Union. It's a great social experiment. Suddenly, having in the city like Rzeszów, the 50% more inhabitants in the city across the last few weeks. In my hometown of Lublin, around 30%. In Warsaw, also around 25%. From 1 month to another, so it's visible. Those of you who are in Warsaw can say more about it.
I think it's safe to assume that the war, and especially the effects of the war, will last for generations to come. It has an effect on the next generations, I think. Does it then also affect the position or policy, cultural policy, of the more institutionalized organizations like national museums in Poland? Will it have an effect on the program, so to speak?
Well, I would first maybe say to leave everyone with who's listening to us with a clear picture that any means of segregation or other restrictions in terms of refugees were introduced by the government, right? Not by the cultural institution. I think it's important to state that, and the cultural institutions where, in terms of the war in Ukraine, they responded immediately, but they also used to respond. Those of them that were not still taken over by the Ministry of Culture, they responded also in many ways to the refugee crisis on Belarusian border that started in last autumn. To the war in Ukraine, it triggered an amazing social response on a social level, but NGO level, and informal initiatives, but also institutional response in terms of institutions of culture that start already answering your question now, to change their programs, to refocus their programs. So there are many ways of responses, also as funding residences for artists or turning into community centers, which also Nowy Theater or many other theaters or culture centers still do. I think this response is massive, and the institutions are testing many tools. And I must say that even the institutions, or at least some of them that were taken over by the Ministry of Culture, they also show some kind of initiative toward the Ukrainian community. It's maybe understood differently or done in a bit different way, but to be sincere and honest, I must say that it's quite a common kind of response to the situation.
Okay, well, it's still with us for much longer than we would hope for. It will affect, as said, many aspects of life. We will closely witness it, if not experience it ourselves. You, of course, live in Poland, so you're the first to experience the direct consequences of the war. Time forces us to stop now, although this is perhaps not the right topic to say time is up. Nonetheless, we have to do so. I want to thank all of you for your participation. Bik Van der Pol, Karolina Plinta, Grzegorz Reske, and Małgorzata Ludwisiak, thank you so much for being with us. I want to also say a big thank you to our own Dutch Culture's country advisor for Poland, Diana Stepanovic, who did all the research and preparations for this program. So thank you, Diana, for your contribution. Thank you again for your participation. Please stay with us so we can perhaps talk a little bit more afterwards. But we end this public program now. And hopefully this has been a program that is also inspiring, informing, but also inspiring for Dutch artists to consider starting an international career, strengthening the international collaboration, even or perhaps especially with a country as Poland, which is so versatile, which is so dynamic, and is currently more or less in the eye of the storm, both politically, socially, and otherwise. Hopefully we could give you a little helping hand in strengthening your international practice. Thank you for joining us for this country focus. There will be more programs made by Dutch Culture in the course of the following weeks. Please keep a close eye on our program, and hopefully we will be welcoming you for a new edition of Country Focus. Thank you again, and hope to see you soon.